All right, so now that you've watched that speech, I would just like to spend a brief amount of time just sort of moving through it in terms of our evaluation form. Now, to some degree, what he's doing there is not exactly what we've been talking about here, but it is as well. He's raising awareness about an issue. He's also laying out some things that people can be doing. And I do think it's an excellent case study. So let's go ahead and move through the evaluation form. So under invention, we've got the speaker discuss the ill and blame and consequences if applicable, effectively and appropriately, discuss cure effectively and appropriately, discussed realistic calls to action effectively and appropriately, had congruent argumentative elements, and used evidence effectively and appropriately. Without a doubt, I just think he did these all excellent. So if we move through his case, and this is more or less how it was laid out, but if we move through his case in terms of those stock issues, ill, he spends a lot of time in the beginning of that speech talking about ill. He's got a very general ill, the problems related to mental illness. And then he moves into a specific ill. So we distinguish, and this is, I think, usually a savvy idea, distinguish between sort of the general ill and the specific ill. His specific ill is the lack of treatment. So we've got all these global issues around mental health, and then specifically, we've got lack of treatment. Then he moves through that to what's the blame. So he's not saying what's the blame for global mental health, but what's the blame for lack of treatment? Well, that's easy. It's insufficient, not enough doctors. So, once again, you've got an opening ill, a general ill is a way of starting the speech, but it's not really what the speech is about. You're getting to the specific ill and the specific blame. That blame is what he's interested in and what he can solve for. So we move from ill into blame to cure. So his cure is task sharing. The cure is not solve all mental health, right? So it's not what that general ill was, but it was there's a problem of global mental health. The specific ill is we don't have enough doctors, specifically because we lack treatment, specifically because we don't have enough doctors, and the cure is task sharing. Then he goes through and he explains in detail the effectiveness of task sharing with scientific studies. So he rattles off these 3 studies that indicates that it can work. Then he ends up talking about some consequences, another stock issue. We've got material consequences when he's talking about the developed world. He said this task sharing can save money and can drive down health costs in the developed world. Then he talks about a social consequence of task sharing. It's empowering. It's a good in and of itself. And then he's got calls to action. Now these are at various places in his speech because they don't always have to come at the end. He's got a professional call to action under that Sundar. He's sort of laying out maybe what medical professionals can do. He's got some social movement call to action. So when he's laying out the movement for global mental health, he's sort of giving you a way of finding out more information, a way of getting involved. And then, of course, he ends with a very personal call to action. At the beginning of the speech, he asks you to think about someone you knew who might have mental health issues, and he ends by saying, reach out to that person. Do something. Be an agent of change. Make some change tomorrow. And then in terms of in those first elements, the stock issues and the calls to action are just really well done, I think. And then in terms of using evidence effectively and appropriately, he has an excellent blend of statistics, examples, and personal narratives. And he really bounces back and forth between stories, examples, and hard facts. And so he's never sitting on any one source of evidence for too long. The one thing that struck me here was that picture of that young girl at around 4 minutes and 20 seconds probably merited a bit more explanation. He seemed to be pulling a lot more meaning out of that photo than I could. It showed this girl chained. Well, I'm not sure the whole story there. Certainly maybe you could unpack that a little bit more, but still it's a powerful and moving image. Then we shift down to arrangement. Oriented the audience to the topic in the introduction appropriately, effectively, most certainly. Arranged the speech in a clear and compelling manner, yes, and concluded the speech appropriately and effectively, most certainly. So there's a good movement in the speech from beginning to end, right? It doesn't lull really at any one point. It's a nice movement overall. And what I found particularly intriguing was how he transitioned from ill into blame. He did so through his personal experience as a doctor, right? So remember, we talk about the general ill of global mental health issues, the specific ill of lack of treatment, and then the blame of lack of training. Well, that transition occurs from ill to blame in his personal narrative. He says, so I went to school and I became a doctor, and then I went to go into, I think initially he says, I went to go practice in Africa, and what I was seeing was a lack of treatment. So that personal narrative is that transition point, and I think it's like we enter the river on the cure side, and we exit the river of his personal narrative on the blame side. I'm sorry, on the ill side and the blame side. So I think that's an interesting way of structuring and arranging that speech, and it works well. In terms of style, his speech here is not really the same speech that we've been working on, but I do think it is a good one for the end of this particular week. Before we get into high oratory, his style, certainly his ethos, is very compelling here. And he has some good stylistic devices. So early on, he does some good repetition. So he says, you can think of at least one person who has this. And that's a stylistic device. That repetition is having an emotional impact. And then finally, under delivery, I think it's just really nice pacing. And there's a wonderful intensity in his voice. He's not loud, but there is this persistent intensity. And it adds to his ethos, and it adds to the engagement of that delivery. So, in terms of the evaluation form, invention, excellent. Arrangement, excellent. Style, for what we're doing, we're going to be doing more high style. For his speech here, excellent. His delivery, excellent. I think this is just a really nice way of demonstrating how you can use these persuasive tools in a real-life setting, in a setting where you're raising awareness about an issue and you're outlining what can be done in general and then what the audience can do specifically. So continue your discussion of the speech in the discussion forums. Continue to work on your persuasive speeches, and I'll see you next week.